Hello, in this video I want to tell you my list of top 5 underrated American presidents. So I won't be mentioning presidents such as Lincoln and Washington because they are not underrated. So I'll focus more on the ones that are seen usually as mostly negative or at least as extremely controversial, but actually did a lot of good. So let me start with Woodrow Wilson. Okay, today he's mostly remembered as an extreme racist, and in fact, he was. His favorite movie was The Birth of a Nation, that glorifies the Ku Klux Klan, that also led to a spike in hate crimes in the United States in combination with a burst in nationalism after World War One. But okay, what do I respect about Woodrow Wilson? Well, the era of the First World War was a very dark period for humanity. So here you can see some of the funniest propaganda posters. Like this poster makes fun of the Germans disrespecting the freedom of the seas, which was the Wilsonian doctrine that claimed that there should be free trade on the seas, and the Germans are destroying American ships with U-boats. Um, but okay, the First World War was truly a dark period for humanity, and out of that chaos and destruction, old monarchies of the Europe fell, and Wilson hoped that a new world can be created. Here you can see the first tanks that also changed the course of the war, but yeah, here you can see that new world being created. And okay, let us also not forget that Wilson managed to convince his Congress to enter the war because of the Zimmermann telegram, and that was a telegram in which the Germans, the German Empire, actually offered these territories to Mexico. So these light green territories to Mexico if they attack the United States on the side of Germany in case of the war between Germany and the United States, because the Kaiser realized that the war with the United States is very likely. But in a bizarre way, his preparation for that war actually led to the war with the United States, because the Americans were outraged by the proposal that Mexico should reclaim their land that was conquered almost 100 years ago. And Wilson takes the opportunity to enter on the side of Great Britain and France, and to create a new world that was inspired by a new world of Wilsonian ideals. And some of these ideals are truly great. For example, open diplomacy without secret treaties, economic free trade, equal trade conditions, and since I'm from Eastern Europe, well, the 10th point is, from my perspective, the most significant. Austria-Hungary to be provided an opportunity for self-determination. So what that meant is that the nations of Eastern Europe in Austro-Hungary should be given their own states, or at least the right to form their own states. And what also needs to be mentioned is that the United States was the only great power to join World War I without asking for additional territory to be given to the United States. So his entry into the war was very much inspired by ideals, and not just by profit, not just by his attempt to to actually secure that Great Britain could return all the loans to the United States. And the Versailles Conference is truly one of the more bizarre events in history of humanity. There are all these forgotten stories from that conference where like 100 or a bit more powerful people were creating a new world out of the ruins of the old one. And For example, there are many tragic and at the same time comic stories. For example, the Japanese came to the conference and they asked for the Japanese race, the yellow race, or however you want to call it, to be recognized as equal to the white race. Although they use the term Japanese race because they saw themselves as superior to the Koreans and other people, and the British refused. They said no, no, the white Europeans are superior to Japanese, and that actually inspired the Japanese to become even more racist and imperialistic themselves. So then there is a story about the Koreans asking to be recognized as a state because they were conquered by Japan, and nobody cared. They just told them, hey, we don't have the time to talk about Korea, we are talking about Germany and Europe. But to me the most interesting story, since I'm from Croatia, is about the Croatian city of Fiume, or Rijeka, and how Wilson almost destroyed the entire conference because he was so determined to defend the city of Fiume from Italian nationalists, the proto-fascists. That I'm talking about D'Annunzio, Gabriele D'Annunzio, the guy that inspired Mussolini. So here you can see the state of Rijeka, or of Fiume. This was the flag of the Free State of Rijeka that was proclaimed. Well, because the Kingdom of Italy and the Kingdom of Yugoslavia couldn't agree who gets the city of Fiume, that had a Italian majority but was surrounded by Croatian villages, and in the entire region Croatians were the majority. And so the League of Nations proclaimed that that Fiume Rijeka will be a free state. And here you can see the flag of the state and the coat of arms of the state of Fiume. And Gabriele D'Annunzio, this guy, there are still statues of him in Italy, an Italian nationalist and the hero of the World War I, with 2,000 volunteers in 1919, occupies Fiume while it was still the protectorate of the League of Nations, and he proclaims himself to be a dictator of the city of Fiume. And Wilson is insisting and telling the Italians, no, you can't annex the city, he has to go. And although he did proclaim the annexation, the Kingdom of Italy never recognized the annexation. And even later, in the 1920, they signed a treaty of Rapallo with the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which proclaims the state of Fiume as a free state, now recognized by Italy as well. And that actually leads to war between the Kingdom of Italy and D'Annunzio. And D'Annunzio, well, he inspired Mussolini in many ways. For example, the alleged Roman salute that was adopted by the fascists comes from D'Annunzio. The black shirts and their symbols come from D'Annunzio. He forced his political opponents to drink castor oil, which Mussolini also did, and he tortured them in such a way, or if you drink enough, then it just kills you. If you drink enough castor oil, it kills you. But he was also a man of culture, and he financed many choral societies and orchestras in the Free State of Rijeka that now became a fascist dictatorship. But he was, surprisingly, he believed in sexual liberty, which is why there were orgies on the streets of Rijeka almost every day. And for example, he had nothing against gay people, but but he still was an imperialist, and he conquered the city and killed his political opponents. And he was even so frustrated by the League of Nations not recognizing him that he proclaimed an anti-League of Nations, and he asked all the oppressed European states like the Irish to join him against the British tyranny. But of course he was a bullshit artist, and for him mean, he only minded the British tyranny because the British didn't recognize him and or his state, his mini-fascist state that inspired Mussolini later, and this is how the city of Fiume looked like. And in the end, the Italian kingdom attacks D'Annunzio and forces him to leave, and Rijeka exists as a free state from 1921, when D'Annunzio is forced to leave. And that mini war happens on Christmas, which is why the Christmas of 1921 is called the Bloody Christmas in the city of Fiume. I'm talking about Rijeka. And after the 5-day war, D'Annunzio flees back to Italy, where he mysteriously falls from the balcony and ends up in the hospital for a long time, probably because Mussolini was worried about D'Annunzio becoming the leader of the fascist party, or maybe the guy just got drunk and fell from the balcony, but I think that it was Mussolini probably. Yeah, and later in 1924 Mussolini conquers the city of Fiume and the city becomes part of Italian territory, and it is the first aggressive act on the international stage by Mussolini. And although Wilson was a racist, he truly did believe that the small nations of Europe should have the right for self-determination, and he refused just to recognize the city of Fiume as Italian just because Italians were the more powerful ones, and he refused to acknowledge the logic of his time that pretty much said, well, if you're on the winning side and if you have a more powerful military, then the land is yours. Okay, try and guess who will be the second underrated president. Žižek, actually, Slavoj Žižek actually loves him.
In Stalinist sense, good Kadrovi, to nominate the proper people. No?
Who's your favorite US president of all time? Who's your favorite president?
I think that, and it makes me very sad, I think that precisely because he was considered a failure, that it was a great misfortune for Carter that he wasn't able to do more. Of course, his presidency was a failure, but obviously he was a relatively decent guy.
100%.
And 100%. So
good guy. Good
guy.
Good man,
okay,
good husband,
you can be now utter cynic and say that what this story proves is that we don't need good guys.
Yes.
Of the tower.
Yes.
I think don't underestimate him. All those Helsinki agreements and all that stuff. I think that Carter did quite a lot in the long term to undermine Soviet communism. Don't underestimate him there. Sometimes soft anti-communism, you conclude agreements, but they undermine, he was not too soft. Carter is a complex guy. Another surprise. I'm not so much opposed to Richard Nixon. I think some leftists told me, if you measure socialist left with how many, I don't know, for the unemployed, students, healthcare, and so on, that under Nixon, this healthcare, social things, this was the high point. Then already Carter, because of economic crisis, had to reduce them and so on. And then he concluded peace with China and so on and so on. I think Nixon, I never believed that Watergate story, two honest journalists can overthrow the most powerful person in the world, No, Nixon is again a much more ambiguous guy. I mean, I'm not saying he's a sympathetic guy.
No, I get it. Believe me, the two people you chose were two people I thought you would have chosen. I thought
really?
I thought you would have
then
chosen.
If I may put it like this, but don't take it personally, you are not complete idiot then. But let me tell you something. No, in my view, there are...
This guy, Richard Nixon. So, of course, there's the Watergate scandal, his Southern strategy that combined with war on drugs that is still doing harm today in the United States. And what needs to be said is he won by less than 1 percentage point over Humphrey. But okay, let us focus also on some good things that he did. Of course, he was impeached, and there are many other bad things about him, but he made peace with China, and that was a historical achievement, not only because he was the first US president to visit Mao's China, but because he made, at least for a while, world a more peaceful place. The peace between China and America also forced the Soviets to negotiate, and these two treaties were signed: the Biological Weapons Convention, which is still in power today, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which reduced the number of anti-ballistic missiles, and it ironically made the world more peaceful, because if you have less anti-ballistic missiles, there's a higher chance that you will just get wiped out during nuclear war. And in this way, both sides couldn't delude themselves by saying, well, we'll actually be able to defend ourselves from the enemy nukes, and the chance of nuclear war is actually reduced if you have less anti-ballistic missiles. And the treaty actually worked pretty well up until 2002, when George Bush terminated it. And yeah, Nixon was also allowed to visit the tombs of the Ming dynasty, which is a big deal. Of course, withdrawal from Vietnam, as you can see here, in 1973. He signed the Paris Peace Accords, the withdrawal of all US and Allied forces within 60 days, the clearing of mines from North Vietnamese territory, and US financial contributions to healing the wounds of war throughout Indochina. And of course, well, I just have to mention some bad things about him again. In Cambodia, his systemic campaign of destruction from the sky led to Pol Pot emerging from the jungle with his fanatics and taking power. But okay, we are moving on to number 3, Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of the New Orleans. So, as president, I would argue he was very successful, and he's one of the Donald Trump's favorite presidents. Trump is here visiting Andrew Jackson's house, and he on many occasions compared himself with Andrew Jackson, but Andrew Jackson, I would argue, was a much better president. He is the only and first United States president that repaid the national debt of the United States, and under him, the first modern presidency of the United States is established. He made the president more powerful and in control of the national treasury, which is, I would argue, good. And he also campaigned on ending corruption and being on the side of the people, of the little guy, against the corrupt elites. And he truly did fight corruption, unlike Trump that just promised to do it. And of course, in foreign policy, he was actually also very successful. He helped the Texas Revolution against Mexico, which was a success, and he managed to force the French, the Spain and the Portuguese to pay reparations to the United States for the damage done to them in the Napoleonic Wars. But okay, the most controversial thing that he did was the Indian Removal Act. So you can see here the 5 civilized tribes that adopted Christianity and slavery from the southern folks. They lived near southern people, so they started also to have black slaves. Well, the 5 civilized tribes, as they were called, were ethnically cleansed. I'm talking about the Indian Removal Act. And thousands of them die, especially Cherokee, and their black slaves also die due to just cold weather. And we also shouldn't forget that one of the biggest slave revolts was actually against the Cherokees, against the Cherokee Nation. But on the other hand, the Seminolas refused to go quietly without a fight, and they also freed many of their black slaves, and they helped other black slaves to escape, and they allowed them to join their army and their resistance against the Florida state, which was trying to wipe out the Seminolas and take their land. And here you can see the Seminola warriors fighting against Florida in the Seminola Wars of Florida. And many also die in these wars. But the question that historians ask today is, did Andrew Jackson save the Indians by ethnically cleansing them from complete annihilation that would have been done by the southern states themselves? So he intervened with federal army and removed them before the southern states could wipe them out completely, or well, was it actually just something unjustifiable, and was it actually genocide? Also remains an open question, and to be honest, I don't know enough about the topic. So you can tell me in the comment section. Yes, some people even compare it with the Hitler's concept of Lebensraum, but of course, yeah, I mean, there is a difference between doing ethnic cleansing in the 19th century and between doing it in the 20th century. Okay, now we have reached Theodore Roosevelt. Well, he was truly a badass. He finally a guy that wasn't a racist on my list, I'm glad to say. So he's the first president to invite a black guy into the White House, and he also, since he was a bit crazy, he insisted on fighting the world heavyweight boxing champion of the time, and he got punched in the eye during the fight and blinded, in fact, on one eye, or at least he severely damaged his eye by fighting the heavyweight champion as president, which is kind of ridiculous. And so he's probably most well known for being the first president that insisted that the United States need to have a strong navy. And he was truly a visionary in this decision, and he realized that the British and the Spanish are losing control of the seas, and that the United States need to control the freedom of the seas, or to protect the freedom of the seas, as Wilson later called it. And it was in fact his decision that made it possible for the United States to win the First World War, and he was also the first to protect the national parks of the United States, which was also an important and a long-lasting decision. And finally, Jimmy Carter, this guy, yeah, he's remembered by many as the guy that allowed the communists to win in Angola. Then he allowed them to again win in Ethiopia. He allowed the Soviets to help the Ethiopians against the Somalis' aggression, as you can see in this picture. And the Nicaraguan revolution was also victorious. That revolution started under him, and it was against the Somoza family, the real life Harkonnens, pretty much, if you ask me. And finally, what often isn't said about Jimmy Carter is that yes, he refused to help immoral and tyrannical regimes under his presidency, which is why the Soviets became overly confident and they decided to launch war in Afghanistan just after the war in Ethiopia was finished. And it was that decision that ultimately destroyed the Soviet economy and led to the victory of the United States in the long run. Or at least that is my take on Jimmy Carter.